fantastic. Not artiste en résidence en City. Encore, if you would like to bid on this artwork, just click on the link below. L'adresse web est en bas. If you would like to take part in our auction, and remember, it closes June 29th at 1800 hours Morocco time. Our next panel, we are discussing distributed digital identity using blockchain technology. We have absolutely the best moderator for this panel. Il est un vieil ami de moi, Julian Gordon, vice-président Asia Pacifique avec Hyperledger. He will be joined by our panelists, who include, first off, Brian Behlendorf, who is the executive director for Hyperledger within the Linux Foundation. Also, Ms. Julie Esser, who is the Senior Vice President, Client Engagement with Bonifii. Also, Mr. Matthew Davie, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Kiva, but also sits on the board of Diem, the forthcoming Facebook cryptocurrency. Alors, sans hésitation, on y va!
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel on distributed digital identity using blockchain technology. I'm Julian Gordon. I'm the VP for Asia Pacific for Hyperledger, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel today. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers of Africa Blockchain Week. It's a great event, wonderful event. I think it's an inaugural event too, and it's inspiring to see the exciting developments happening in blockchain across the continent. Perhaps one of the most important and one of the most vibrant areas of discussion and development for blockchain, both globally and in Africa, is the area of distributed digital identity. And I'm delighted today to be here with this expert panel with amazing experience and expertise in the area. We couldn't ask for a better panel. So with that, I would like to hand over to our esteemed panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and we're going to do that in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm General Manager for Blockchain, Healthcare, and Identity at the Linux Foundation, and I've been leading the Hyperledger initiative. I currently also lead the Linux Foundation Public Health Initiative. And in these three areas, in blockchain technology, healthcare, and identity, there's so much common purpose, so much common need and overlap. I thought I'd try to have my fingers on all three of those domains, and I think they'll all come to fore here in this conversation today.
Thank you. And now I will go to alphabetically, is it Julie?
Hello there, I'm Julie Esser. I'm Senior Vice President of Client Engagement for Bonifii, which was formerly called Ledger. We are a credit union service organization that serves primarily credit unions in the United States. And we have our flagship product called MemberPass, which is being distributed by credit unions to credit union members throughout the United States. What I do at Bonifii is, right now, I'm responsible for adoption. We know where adoption is leading with distributed ledger and digital identities, and the importance of adoption. And my primary focus this year has been on adoption. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of my insights with you.
That's great, Julie. Definitely look forward to hearing that. And Matthew?
Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Davey. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Kiva. For those who don't know, Kiva is a global nonprofit. We do microfinance in 94 countries around the world, including most of sub-Saharan Africa. And in my role as Chief Strategy Officer, in addition to overseeing our long-term strategy, I oversee our emerging technology portfolio, which includes stuff around digital identity and distributed ledger technology. And so I'll look forward to talking about some implementations of national scale digital ID on the continent.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So what a great panel. Thank you. A great experience. And I think what we'll start with is really maybe a definition of where we are and why identity is so important. And what have there been the challenges? Why are we talking about identity? And particularly as identity has moved digital, so digital identity. So Brian, maybe you a pioneer of the internet, experience, why didn't it happen early on in the internet? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I kind of think, I feel like identity was one of the pieces that the early internet folks just kind of punted on. And we got started in the 60s with mainframes and time sharing, and this idea that your identity was relevant to some big server somewhere. And that was the appropriate place to store a name and a password. And then anything interesting about you should be on that remote server somewhere, right? And I think there's a direct tie between these mainframe systems of the 60s and 70s and Facebook of today, where Facebook is still like the mainframe from a social networking point of view and from an identity point of view, right? Or LinkedIn, or a small handful of these other large sites. But identity doesn't work that way in the real world. In the real world, you're not defined by what the government thinks about you or by what company thinks about you. You're defined by a collection of things that you've amassed over a lifetime that are very tightly attached to you and survive even if the school, your diploma is still good. Even if the college you went to goes out of business and disappears, right? Your birth certificate is still good, even if the hospital you were born in shut down, right? And when you present a birth certificate or a diploma or a driver's license or some other type of credentials to somebody, they can verify that. They can look at that and say, okay, this is good, even without having to call long distance to the person who issued that, and without that person who issued that credential knowing, without the government knowing that I've presented a government ID to enter a bar to have a drink, right? So this real world experience of how identity works didn't before have a digital version or a digital comparable until we started to think about the world of self-sovereign identity. I mean, really, to be fair, going back to like the PGP web of trust, kind of this idea of certificates and things, we'll give that its due credit. It never really took off then. But in the last few years, we've started to see this idea of a wallet that you hold close with identity documents, things that are verifiable, that are credentials about you, that are attested to by other parties. It's starting to really become a different paradigm and a much more effective paradigm, putting you as the individual at the pivot point of sharing information about your identity, rather than these other remote systems talking to each other about who you are. And that's just much more powerful and much more compelling. And there's a role for blockchain technology in this. It's not to store those documents, but to be instead helpful in helping prove who you are. But there's so much that's evolving in this space, but it is all about a different, almost more humanist perspective on how digital identity should work. And it's been really amazing to see this start to get adopted and take off.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. And yeah, self-sovereign identity seems to be the key thing, right, for taking the digital identity forward. So Matthew, maybe we'll start with you, right? Kiva. So what's Kiva's been experience around digital identity?
Yeah, thank you. It's always great to go after Brian too, because he says everything. So like I borrow a lot of my truisms from Brian. So thank you, Brian. Especially the one about the going into the bar. Like, how useful would your driver's license be for going into a bar if they had to call the DMV when you were at the door? Like, not very useful at all in the real world. And that's how digital ID, up until a couple of years ago, as Brian was referencing, worked. You had to connect to some centralized server, and that's really where your identity was stored. And you would kind of lease your identity when you were using that online or in a digital format. Okay, off my soapbox. So how did Kiva get here? Kiva's been operating for 15 years. We've deployed $1.6 billion in 94 countries around the world, mostly to un- and underbanked individuals. So like last mile vulnerable populations. And we took a hard look 3.5 years ago at why aren't the conditions getting better? Like, we're giving all these loans, we're working with all these great financial institutions on the ground, and still people are not bootstrapping their way into the formal financial sector. They're not getting a savings account. They're not getting a transactional account, a checking account. Remittances are still like cash to a Western Union, high fees. Why isn't it getting better? And if you start peeling the layers of the onion back, you really get down to lack of verifiable identity, that these individuals might take out a loan from Kiva and one of their partners, but another financial institution across the street doesn't know whether or not they're cross-indebted because there's no unique identity hanging those different transactions together. So that institution has to assume they have no credit history or that they're a bad credit history because they have an incomplete record. So without solving for identity, we actually can't create the conditions for an on-ramp to formal financial services. We cannot create systemic financial inclusion because there's not going to be financial institutions competing for their business. And I would posit this same falls for almost every market-driven activity, that if you can't foster this environment where consumers have choice and optionality, and where businesses have to compete, the markets won't take off. And so when we took a look at it, our thesis is to ride the digital wave, that we're not looking at analog credentials. We believe that over the next decade, or now over the next 9 years, by 2030, ostensibly all humans will be able to have access to some form of digital ID. And so we're very focused on the interface of, as identities are generated, Brian's story, like birth certificates issued, that typically sits in a government database. That is a form of identity that the individual has no access to, or they might have a national ID and they're printed a card once, but the data still exists somewhere in a server. How do we get that to a user's digital wallet, and how do we make that usable? And I'll save some anecdotes for later, but that's why identity is so important to us at Kiva, and why we have a technology practice specifically around the exact infrastructure Brian was talking about, decentralized digital identity that has a very lightweight blockchain component, none of your data is on the blockchain, and puts it in a digital wallet that's fully in your control, that you're sovereign over, and you decide when you want to share, the same way you'd pull a physical driver's license out. When do you want to share your digital national ID credentials?
Okay, thank you. Julie, do you want to talk a little about Bonifii,
Yeah.
their journey?
Sure, absolutely. So we started out in 2017. Again, I mentioned that we are a credit union service organization. And for those of you that might not be familiar with credit unions, they are non-for-profit financial cooperatives. There are over 86,000 credit unions globally in 118 different countries, and represent and serve more than 290 billion members. And so it is a significant population of credit union membership. The philosophy of credit unions is unique too. Their basis for being, their philosophical nature is around service to their members and giving lower rates and lower fees on different products and services, and also serving the underserved on services to markets that other financial institutions don't pay attention to. And in the financial service industry, where the biggest challenge is as it relates to identity theft. In particular, I read that every 15 seconds, there's a new incident of financial risk that occurs. And so the challenge for many financial institutions is how they interact with their consumers. And it's the identity verification component is all over the board. When you're thinking about calling into the call center, oftentimes you are sharing personal information about yourself that could be on social media someplace. When you're going into the branch, you're sharing a driver's license. Again, to Brian's point, how do you trust that proof? And COVID's only accelerated the financial fraud aspect of interacting with consumers to conduct their financial business. I read recently that 32% of consumers have experienced some type of financial identity fraud. And that really impacted 83% of those consumers because they weren't able to apply for a loan or get credit to get through this crisis, this COVID crisis in particular. So it is a huge problem. And with MemberPass, we are providing a simple and secure way for members to interact with their credit union across any touch point. So it creates a very seamless experience for the member. So think of it as identity as a service, so to speak. They're not only giving their members a service where they control their identity components through MemberPass, the digital passport, but it also provides relief for the credit union as well, because they can reduce their financial risks associated with these identity theft type of problems.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the technology, so I think that's two great examples right there, mainly around a lot of financial services there as well, and around identity. So maybe Brian, could you talk a little bit more about self-sovereign identity, or maybe the technology, maybe even the Hyperledger technology that I think is prevalent in this space? As it is a blockchain conference, I think people will hear about what the underlying technology is.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things that it builds upon that are non-blockchain technologies. I'm going to start with those. One is the idea of public key cryptography and digital signatures, right? This is something that has been around now for almost 40 years. I forget when the RSA patent was first issued, like early 80s, something like that. But it's based on this idea that you have a public key and a private key that are combined together. And the public key is one thing you can send me a message to. You can also sign messages with that key. And I can verify that this document really came from you, or it was something that somebody actually signed by looking up their public key when they sign it with their private key. So this is the foundation. This is something that is very well understood technologies. What has come about recently are two other technologies, one called Verifiable Credentials, which is basically a data format for having signed data, signed documents. You know, the digital equivalent of a driver's license or diploma or birth certificate, there's a structure to it. And the verifiable credential structure is that structure. The third is something called a digital identifier, the DID. This is kind of like a URL for identity. And they can be long-lived, they can be very short-term. You could have a DID for your academic record and a different one for your healthcare record. But the idea is that it's kind of what you form these documents around when you hold them in a wallet. Now let's talk about the blockchain part of this. Finding a signature, finding a public key to be able to validate whether a signature is good has long been a very difficult to solve problem unless somebody somewhere is running a central directory of all of these keys or all the roots of these keys, which introduces all sorts of questions about how do you get a key into that directory? How do you find, where all the keys are? And so what blockchain technology solves for is a nice way of decentralizing these kinds of directories, these kinds of collective collections of data that everybody should know, because there's nothing sensitive about a public key, and making sure everybody has a chance to add their public key, or every institution has a chance to add it, whether or not you happen to be, have a relationship or not with the right government, right, or the right company. So that's really what we're seeing with these digital identity networks that have emerged using a combination of Hyperledger Indy for the ledger, and then wallets that hold these kinds of documents. There's underlying software that makes all these wallets work better together, that's embodied in a project called Hyperledger Aries. So the combination of the two of these have really helped accelerate adoption of both these non-blockchain standards, VCs and DIDs and everything, but also this particular model of building these ledger networks for sharing these keys and all that kind of stuff. So that we've seen that deployed pretty widely out there. There's other ways to use blockchain technology to in the service of self-sovereign identity. But again, I will harp on the fact that the blockchain is not used to store your personal data, and that's a really important thing to understand underneath all of this. It's used to decentralize that way of discovering everyone's public keys so that everyone can verify these signatures. And do you remember how I mentioned your diploma should survive even when the university that issued that diploma disappears? Well, this is how we get there.
Okay, so maybe I Matthew or Julie can talk a little bit about how maybe you've implemented it. Obviously, you're not going to disappear. So, but how is the what have your challenges been in doing this? We've talked about technology. This is new technology. What have been challenges for? Maybe I can start with Julie. What have been challenges for you for implementing this self-sovereign identity technology for credit unions?
Yeah, well, from our perspective, we had done some real early research among consumers, and we were throwing out technical terminology like blockchain 4 or 5 years ago. And, as you can expect, it was met with a lot of resistance. It sounds too good to be true. I don't understand this. Why would I want to trust anything like this? Fast forward to today, and it's a lot different. They really don't care necessarily about what the underlying technology is, but they want to be able to be assured that whoever is providing this is a trusted, reliable source that is looking out for their best interest. So that was one early learning that we found, is not to propagate the use of the technology among consumers, because that creates just a lot of skepticism. But what we're seeing now with adoption is they absolutely love the experience. Clearly, those consumers that are used to digital banking experiences, like using or accessing their accounts through their mobile phones or online, have a greater likelihood to adapt to it. And quite honestly, those are the individuals that are at higher risk for identity theft because they are more digital. Also anybody that, of course, that has been victimized of identity theft will adopt this product instantly, without a doubt. And so it's incorporating member pass in all of the credit union's channels. We're also synchronizing all the credit union's back end systems so that they can incorporate member pass into their workflows. And so when the frontline staff is greeting a member at the drive-up window, they'll know instantly whether or not they are enrolled in member pass, and so they can offer that to their membership right away. We're also looking at how we can improve that member experience so that when a member is in the branch lobby or near a branch location, we could identify them even faster so that the first question that's asked of the frontline staff is not, Mr. Gordon, can I see your ID? It is, hi, Mr. Gordon, how can I help you today? And get right to the transaction. And that's pretty exciting.
And do actually most consumers actually know that they're using member pass? If I'm a credit union customer, would I know it?
Yeah, correct. So member pass is the digital passport wallet that holds all the credentials. And then every credit union issues their own credentials. And so we're using blockchain and creating our own registry of credit union issuers worldwide eventually. And this will allow any verifier to verify that, are ensure that the credit union that is issued is a bona fide, I had to get that in there, issuer of those credentials. So and we're using not only distributed ledger technology, but biometrics and cryptography as well.
Interesting. And does that help? Does that help the KYC kind of if you're moving from credit union to credit union? Would that be
Absolutely.
something?
KYC, or know your customer, is a regulatory process that all financial institutions have to go by. And so this is where they have to confirm that the individual that they are interacting with or setting up a new account for is truly the authentic self. And well, that's sometimes hard to do when you're presented documents that are not authentic, right? And so while credit unions are under this KYC requirement, we're able through this technology to improve the efficiency of that entire process and reduce a lot of expense for the credit union. And think about, credit unions are known of their collaborative nature. And so they have a channel that's called shared branching, where it enables credit unions in the US, there are 23,000 branches across the US, to share branch locations. The biggest challenge with that channel has been identity fraud. How do I know that credit union, Mr. Gordon from ABC Credit Union is, can do business with this credit union across this country? And so we can see how member pass is going to be a great problem solver with that channel and provide a lot of efficiencies for it.
Okay, thank you. That's a great solution, right? And solve so many problems. So Matthew, I think you're in a completely different kind of world, right? So can you talk a bit about your challenges, also a little bit about, I know you've done some amazing work in Sierra Leone, so I'd really love to hear, how that's going. I've seen it, publicized and I would love to hear about that too.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the challenges when you're talking about bringing digital identity, and especially this kind of forward-looking decentralized digital identity, I'd say there's kind of two primary challenges. One is a perception versus reality. Like as soon as you say the word blockchain and some of these other words, there are misconceptions about what it means for how the identity operates. Let's go back to how Brian described it. Like you just have to walk stakeholders through, here's actually how this works, and here's what data is where, because there's a lot of data jurisdictional issues when you're talking about national level identity programs. The second one is, Kiva focuses on partnering with the public and the private sector. Like we believe, like we use the driver's license as the example earlier, but the most useful identity for you or identification for you tends to be issued by the public sector and used in the private sector. Your passport, your driver's license, your social security number. my gym card's not nearly as valuable. It's a great identity for when I go to my gym, but it doesn't help me pass a KYC check and open a bank account. I can't go through the airport with my gym card. Again, necessary to have a wallet that can hold all of them. But the problem we're trying to solve for people to have account opening really is that public sector issued ID. So again, misperception and then getting people to move at once. I can use Sierra Leone to talk about how you can how we solved both of those problems or worked with our stakeholders to solve them. So in Sierra Leone, we started working with them about 2.5 years ago. They have a financial inclusion mandate, and from the president's office on down, wanted to look at how they could harness digital to drive financial inclusion nationwide. They're one of the least developed countries, small country, about 5 million adults, 7.5 million total population in West Africa. We worked with the central bank, we worked with the prudential regulator who actually sits within the central bank, and then worked with all of the private sector financial institutions. There's not too many of them, there's like 35 private sector financial institutions in the country that are regulated, but really to talk about how could we take where the identity data was then, which was in a national digital identity, the National Civil Registration Authority. How do we take that and unlock that and get that to individuals in a way that they can use it? And then on top of that, make it so it can be used by financial institutions. And it's really easy for those of us in blockchain and technology to be like, well, technology-wise, that's easy. Like stand up Hyperledger areas and indies, connect to their database, have them issue verifiable credentials, and give some APIs to the banks. But there's a big missing component, and it's not consumer education. Consumers can still go to the bank and use this. You know, like we were talking about with MemberPass, a lot of the stuff lives in the background. You don't put blockchain or even the technology face forward with individual consumers. The piece that's missing is policy of banks being able to say, I can use this for a KYC check. Because you can give all the technology in the world, and if there's not an enabling environment to use it, you're not going to have rapid uptake. And so that's actually where a lot of the investment in terms of making this work. And I'm talking about financial services, so heavily regulated, but the same would go for healthcare, government services, maybe a little bit less so for education, but thinking through the policy implications of if we're trying to do something mass market, and Kiva is interested in these population scale because these are population scale problems with financial exclusion globally, you really have to think about how do you align so that the central bank or the prudential regulator can update the regulation saying, here's a electronic know your customer verification, here's how it works. And beyond that, say specifically this platform. So in Sierra Leone, we've helped them build the National Digital Identity Platform. It lives within the central bank. And it is a tool that allows banks, financial service providers to almost for free do KYC verifications in real time with remote authentication, all that stuff. We needed them to actually not only build and help support it, but also allow that to be a viable pathway. Some quick stats on that just to show the power, and not the power of anything Kiva's done, the power of this type of technology. In a place like Sierra Leone, it used to take 2 weeks and cost about $1.40 US to do a KYC verification, and only if you had the proper documentation, which most people didn't. Most people would get an ID card, it was a voter ID card, they'd vote and they'd throw it away because voting was over. I don't need that anymore. Or my birth certificate, like fat chance I still have my paper birth certificate that was issued in 1970, whatever. After, so it was $1.40, 2 weeks if you had the documentation. After now, any individual can walk into one of the branches, can remotely authenticate using a biomatcher and their national ID number, reduces the search space, and in 11 seconds, and at the underlying cost is about 1/3 of a penny to do this. So suddenly for consumers, this is why I said you don't put it consumer first. It's totally fine that this is a magic trick. They get the full consent in front of them saying, you're about to share with this bank this information. But for them, they walked in the day before, couldn't open an account. They walk in today, and in 11 seconds, they can choose to open an account. It's stunning what you're able to do if you can move all of these counterparties at once.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, 140 to 3 cents. That's pretty good, right? Amazing. And obviously, and do they use this the NDIP? Is it just used for is that just for Kiva activity, or is it used? Is this for broader?
Yeah, so we're not doing anything Kiva specific. All of our technology initiatives are how do we create an ecosystem? You know, my ultimate goal and all of our ultimate goal would be Kiva goes away because we solve the problem. We're a nonprofit. We would like to have competitive ecosystems serving these people. So this is foundational tech. In Sierra Leone, it's implemented, and it's going to be, we're transitioning ownership right now to the government for them to run it as a digital public good. And you know, that's the way we believe you can actually keep the price super cheap, keep the service up and reliable. And importantly, when we're talking about national scale systems like this, no private company like Kiva was elected or appointed. Like, we're a private sector entity that at the end of the day, we actually believe a lot of these tools do belong in the public sector, because that's the only place that individuals have expressed their agency and choice to say, here's who I want in office, here's how I want my life to be run.
That's great. So Julie, I think you want to add something there, or actually, I think one of the key things seems to be working with regulatory authorities, which obviously key. Is that something that obviously credit unions, you've had to do that as well?
No, absolutely. Yeah, we are in close contact with the credit union regulator, which is the National Credit Union Administration. And Matthew is absolutely right. So the foundation of everything that we do rests on the governance framework. It's the rules of the highway. And financial institutions have experience with understanding what other type of governance frameworks look like. You look at the card associations and the rules and regulations that they've established. It's the same type of thing, only in the digital identity space. And so we've gotten a lot of support from regulators on what we're doing. And you know, it's only going to grow from here. It's pretty exciting to be able to match both you know, the credit union space and what they're doing with numbers, and also the regulatory aspect of it.
And Brian, I think I'd like to now maybe talk at one of the topics of the moment, COVID and vaccine credentials. I think there's a lot of work that maybe you could share that is underlined, a lot of it by Esser.
Yeah, so obviously this year in 2021, recovery and reopening from the pandemic is something that many countries are now able to start to explore. We're starting to see vaccines distributed, not as quickly as anyone wants, not as universally, but it's rolling out there, and we're going to see, you know, COVAX really get fired up and distributing a lot of these. So as countries start to get slowly more vaccinated, you want to create safe spaces for the people who have been vaccinated to be able to gather indoors, or many countries are starting to require proof of vaccination to be able to cross a border. And it suddenly becomes very important to think about the questions that most people don't often think about when it comes to digital identity, questions like your medical privacy when you're in these very public places, right? There isn't really an expectation of privacy when you're crossing a national border. You're carrying your passport with you, you're showing it to somebody, a border guard. But should that border guard be able to see what is essentially a health record, right? Or should they just be able to see, okay, this person has been vaccinated by the standards of their country, and we'll let them in. And these standards do differ. You know, there's different vaccines out there, that sort of thing. So a lot of folks have started to ask, how do we do this digitally? Because, you know, as Matthew talked about, sometimes documents get lost. Paper documents have a certain frailty to them. They're certainly very privacy preserving. The nice thing about paper is I can hold it. I know when I've shown it to somebody, it's hard to copy actually in the immediate when I'm presenting it to somebody. All these wonderful qualities from a privacy point of view, but you know, it makes it hard to, for example, buy tickets to a concert if you have to prove your vaccination status to buy these tickets. So a lot of folks have started to ask, well, how do we do this digitally and do it in a way that doesn't create a massive surveillance concern, a massive privacy concern. And so many people in the self-sovereign identity community have been working really since the beginning of the pandemic to try to articulate how would you use this technology to create a privacy preserving approach to proof of vaccination status, or even proof of test result, right? Even before we get to vaccines universally distributed, you know, there's widespread testing out there as a means to ensure a safe working environment or otherwise. And that should be a part of this as well. I shouldn't have to share a whole medical test result with somebody. I should be able to just share, like, you know, a green check that comes from an authorized person that we both mutually trust. So this effort has kind of come together in something called the COVID Credentials Initiative, which is now a part of the Linux Foundation Public Health Initiative. And it was really just a network of technologists, of medical experts, of others kind of advising companies and increasingly governments on how to deploy these kinds of solutions. Then we partnered up with another Linux organization called the Trust Over IP Foundation, as well as a party external to us called ID 2020, around something called the Good Health Pass Collaborative, which is which has its goal of helping expand explain how to reopen borders, reopen society through the use of this technology in a way that, again, is privacy preserving, meets the government's needs for knowing, who people are without them knowing where everyone goes, right? Finding that balancing act, and being really rooted in the concept of privacy by design. That collective has now put together a 180-page document describing how to weave these different standards together, the kind of trust registries and networks that need to be stood up in each country to make sure that people who are, when you get the vaccine, the person giving you the vaccine is also at that same time able to give you on the spot a digital certificate, or perhaps later on follow up with a digital certificate. And the most important thing is finding ways for this all to be interoperable. Many of these kinds of systems have started to be deployed in the European Union, in the state of New York, in Singapore, and South Korea. And they all have little differences, even if many of them use the same verifiable credential technology and DIDs and these kind of building blocks. And so now with the Linux Foundation Public Health, we're really working with these government projects, with the vendors who are serving those governments, to use the Good Health Pass Collaborative as a blueprint, which is actually what they call their document, the Blueprint for Interoperability, for weaving these together into an interoperable space, so that if you're a citizen in France, for example, you should be able to not only use your proof of vaccination status as a way to be able to cross the border, not only to another European Union country, you should be able to use it to cross the border to Canada. And if a concert in Canada you wanted to go to requires that proof of vaccination status, you should be able to use that same system without having to go and get another vaccination, or without having to go through a whole lot of hoops to be able to prove that, or take another test, for example, to prove that you're clean, to prove that you're vaccinated. So all of this is about trying to get to what we have on the internet today with email, what we have with lots of other interoperability systems, but doing it with a much greater, higher standard for privacy and privacy by design in the system. The good news is this is getting adopted out there. There are running production systems today using these standards, and being able to, this is a hot war, so to speak, between those who want to centralize this and those who want to decentralize it. But the folks who are, there really is no alternative. This set of standards are how we weave this together. It feels like that moment when AOL, got connected to the internet, and it was like, okay, this feels almost preordained, like this was meant to be in terms of how the underlying technologies weave together. So that's the moment we're in right now, and self-sovereign ID is playing a key role in that.
Yeah, it's amazing the stuff that's happening, and I think COVID, tragedy of COVID has accelerated a lot of these technologies. So that leads me now, in the last few minutes, leads me up to a kind of lightning round kind of question, which I'm going to ask you basically two questions in one, right? So between 1 and 10, where are we with distributed digital identity, or SSI, today? And then where will we be in 5 years? I'm going to do this in reverse alphabetical order. So Matthew, I'll start with you.
Perfect. So I get to level set what 1 through 10 means. Look, on where are we today? I would call us in like the second, I'd call us a 2. Like we're in like kind of the second inning of a lot of the foundations are there and you're starting to see uptick, but there's not mass adoption. But I'm hopeful, and I feel like we're on the path to mass adoption of these systems. And again, to recognizing that just more decentralized systems are going to be more resilient and better serve us in the future than centralized. In 5 years, I hope for us to be at a 5. I don't think we'll be at a 10, but I hope for us to continue with relatively rapid uptick. And a 5 for me would be where you're using it in daily life, and probably without even knowing it. But like whether it's a vaccine certificate to buy a concert ticket, or whether it's porting my health record across a national border, or opening a bank account in another country, like that to me would be a 5.
And maybe just an add-on question for you specifically, as you're working in lots of developing countries. Do you think in developing countries, is it the same number? Do you think there'll be a greater adoption because there's less legacy in certain parts of the world?
I mean, I think today we're probably not as far along in developing countries, just because the infrastructure has not been invested in, and there's less technical capacity, both in terms of raw infrastructure and human capital. In 5 years, it may well be ahead of the developed countries for the exact reason you noted of there's not any legacy holding back in a lot of these countries that are just digitizing. A lot of countries are not laying down copper wire. People are going straight to mobile phones and smartphones. So I would call us at a 1 or a 0.5 today in most developing countries, but we could be at a 6 or a 7 in 5 years in some of those countries, because it will just leapfrog all of the legacy stuff that has held the developed world back.
Interesting. Thanks. So Brian?
If that's what Matthew's definition of 5 or 7 is, is that kind of widespread usage. I'm amazed to think what 10 might be. I definitely agree with him that we're really at the early stages now. At 2, there are production systems out there. Both Matthew and Julie's systems are in production today, which is exciting. But certainly, I agree that widespread use is still far off. But when it happens, it'll happen in a way that most people might not even realize. It'll become just a natural part of how they present ID when they're taking out a loan, or when they are engaging with somebody who has some business process that requires you to prove who you are. Watching how systems like Aadhaar got adopted, I mean, this is pretty different from Aadhaar. It's more decentralized, is going to require more cooperation between government and companies in a given country, whereas Aadhaar was able to be really like centrally mandated and implemented kind of top down. But there's certain power to this, and the network effects, of course, that come from the use of this technology. So I think country by country, there'll be these inflection points where it goes from being viable pilot and, okay, let's start with production, to, oh no, this is the way that everything has to work, right? Or the way that within a few short years, every government not only had put up a website, but it gave you a way to pay taxes through a website, right? Like there's these inflection points. My hope certainly is that open source software and having a network of vendors who can work with these different projects, go into countries and build things that are interoperable, are key to getting that inflection point up, so that when everyone's ready, this stuff can be adopted very quickly.
Thanks. And Julie, we're coming very short time, so you have to give, I think you haven't got time for just the numbers.
Oh, okay. A little bit more optimistic.
All right.
I think we've seen a lot of siloed use cases. Yeah. We're seeing a lot more of them. And I think for broader adoption, definitely making this more of the standard and not just an option. And at least more interoperability too is going to really drive those numbers to the 7-8 range.
Okay, well, thank you all. We didn't have enough time. We never have enough time. Really appreciate such great expertise. That's such a great subject, and hopefully we'll be at a 10 soon. I think we the community, and I ask everyone out there to get involved in this. It's a great area and really important area. So thank you everybody for listening, and take care, and please keep safe.